Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video. Ensure you like, comment and subscribe so you don't miss out on new content. Today's focus is the colour purple context. This is for students studying the novel at A level. It will most probably be a comparison between this and another novel, perhaps The Handmaid's Tale. Nevertheless, this video will help you learn about the context of the novel. The novel is about a girl called Celie who is the protagonist and narrator of The Colour Purple. She is a poor, uneducated 14-year-old black girl living in rural Georgia. Celie starts writing letters to God because her father Alfonso beats and rapes her. Alfonso has already impregnated Celie once, and Celie gave birth to a girl, whom her father stole and presumably killed in the woods. Celie has a second child, a boy, whom her father also steals. Celie's mother one day becomes seriously ill and dies. The novel shows how Celie battles through her life being abused and struggling to cope with being treated constantly bad. The novel ends with Celie reuniting with her younger sister, whom she thought was dead. When looking at context, there are two main sections I often look at. First, biographical context, and then socio-historical context. The biographical context is mostly about the author's life, and the socio-historical context focuses primarily on what was happening at that particular time in society. So let's start with the biographical context. The author of the novel is Alice Walker. Alice Walker was born on February 9, 1944, in the small rural town of Eatonton, Georgia. She was shot in her eye by her brother and left blind in one eye. Walker went to college and got pregnant, and then she considered suicide. After careful consideration, she got an abortion. Later on, she got married and had one daughter. Eventually, she unfortunately divorced her husband. During their relationship, they were being racially abused in Mississippi. In 1983, Walker coined the term womanist in her collection In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which means a black feminist or feminist of colour. Now we are going to look at the socio-historical context. Black people were treated very badly. Just because slavery had been abolished did not mean that black people were treated equally to whites. During the time of 1910 and 1940, black people were treated appallingly. There were segregation laws that meant that black people didn't have the same rights that white people had. The novel is set between 1910 and 1940. Slavery ended in 1863. Blacks were freed from slavery and began to enjoy greater rights as citizens, though full recognition of their rights remained a long way off. Most black children had not attended school in the year before the census, and white children were much more likely to have attended. So the members of a typical African American family at the start of the 20th century lived and worked on a farm in the South and did not own their home. Children in these families were unlikely to be in school, even at very young ages. Black people grew cotton and many were farmers. They were allowed to go to school, but the school systems were very bad. There were no improvement in resources as they were pumped into white schools. Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. It was between 1877 and at the beginning of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. There were different rules in different states. An example is, black and white people were not able to get married or live in the same house. Education was another story. Black schools were vandalized and destroyed, and bands of violent whites attacked, tortured and lynched black citizens in the night. As the protagonist is a black woman, I think it's also important that we also look at how women were treated in the early 20th century to get a better idea of how Celie may feel. Women were not equal to men, nor could they vote. Women had labour jobs, such as farming and working in factories, or if they were fortunate enough to be married, they were stay-at-home mothers. Some women also worked as seamstresses. In fact, women struggled massively without a spouse, as men were the superior gender. Black women had very little or in fact no political power. Some sources estimate that 58% of all enslaved women aged 15 to 30 years were sexually assaulted by slave owners and other white men. Due to laws defining them as property, enslaved women had no legal protection from sexual assault. Acts of sexual violence against African American men could also affect enslaved women. Women who were considered strong was sold as breeders and routinely sexually assaulted to birth more children into slavery. It was a very difficult time for women in the early 20th century, and Walker did an amazing job when including what happened in her novel. When The Colour Purple was published, it unleashed a storm of controversy. It initiated heated debates about black cultural representation, as a number of male African American critics complained that the novel reaffirmed old racist stereotypes about pathology in black communities, and of black men in particular. Critics also charged Walker with focusing heavily on sexism at the expense of addressing notions of racism in America. Nonetheless, The Colour Purple also had its ardent supporters, especially among black women, and others who praised the novel as a feminist fable. So from scrutinising context, it is clear that the author Alice Walker had a difficult upbringing, and in the early 20th century, it was a difficult time in general for black people, especially women. This is part 1 of what will be a 3-part introduction to context. I hope this was useful. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Bye!